In the dead of night, February 8, 1904, the world held its breath. Without a formal declaration of war, Japanese torpedo boats descended upon the Russian fleet anchored at Port Arthur. The Russo-Japanese War had begun with a thunderclap. In the months that followed, Japan, a nation seen by the West as a small, up-and-coming power, achieved the unthinkable. On the battlefields of Manchuria and the waters of the Yellow Sea, Japanese forces consistently outmaneuvered and defeated the mighty Russian Empire. For the first time in modern history, an Asian nation was decisively beating a major European power. It was a moment of immense national pride for Japan, a validation of its rapid modernization since the Meiji Restoration. Newspapers in Tokyo celebrated victory after victory. But behind the triumphant headlines and cheering crowds, a terrifying secret was festering in the heart of the Japanese government. The war was bankrupting the nation. Every bullet fired, every battleship set to sea, every soldier fed was draining Japan's treasury at an alarming rate. The initial war budget was completely exhausted within months. The Japanese High Command had plans for massive new offensives, for landing entire new armies on the continent to lay siege to the fortress of Port Arthur, but they had no money to fund them. Victory on the battlefield was meaningless if the country's economy collapsed. The war effort, and perhaps the future of Japan itself, was teetering on the brink of financial ruin. The generals could win the battles, but they couldn't win the war without money, and Japan was running out of both. In this moment of extreme crisis, the fate of the empire fell upon the shoulders of one man, Takahashi Korekiyo. As the vice governor of the Bank of Japan, Takahashi was the nation's financial mastermind. His mission was as desperate as it was critical: sail to the financial capitals of the world, London and New York, and convince foreign bankers to lend Japan the colossal sums of money it needed to continue the war. It was a task that seemed almost impossible from the start. When Takahashi arrived in New York, he was met with polite handshakes and closed doors. The titans of Wall Street saw Japan as a huge risk. They were a small Asian nation fighting a war against the gigantic Russian Empire. Who, in their right mind, would bet against Russia? To these bankers, Russia was a known quantity, a European giant with vast resources. Japan was an upstart, an unknown. They listened to Takahashi's proposals, nodded thoughtfully, and then showed him the door. No one was willing to lend him a single dollar. Dejected, he sailed for London, the financial center of the world, hoping for a different outcome. But the reception was just as frosty. British bankers, while perhaps more sympathetic to Japan's cause due to the Anglo-Japanese alliance, were still businessmen. They shared the same skepticism as their American counterparts. The risk was simply too high. Day after day, Takahashi faced rejection. The pressure was immense. Every telegram from Tokyo brought more news of dwindling funds and urgent requests for cash. He could feel the window of opportunity closing. His mission was a complete failure. With a heavy heart, he made preparations to return home to Japan, empty-handed, to deliver the news that would likely seal his country's defeat. Just as Takahashi was packing his bags in his London hotel room, preparing for the humiliating journey home, a fateful message arrived. It was an invitation to a dinner party. The host was a prominent London banker, but the guest of honor was a name that commanded respect and awe across the entire financial world: Jacob Schiff. Schiff was the head of Kuhn, Loeb & Co., one of the most powerful investment banks in America, a direct rival to J.P. Morgan himself. He was a quiet, intensely private man, but his influence was immense. More importantly, Jacob Schiff was a devout Jew, and he harbored a deep, personal, and burning hatred for the Russian Empire and its ruler, Tsar Nicholas II. This hatred wasn't born from financial rivalry or political disagreement. It was forged in the fires of persecution. Just a year earlier, in 1903, the city of Kishinev in the Russian Empire had been the site of a horrific pogrom. For 2 days, mobs rampaged through the Jewish quarter, incited by false, state-sponsored rumors. They brutalized families, destroyed homes, and shattered a community, all while the police stood by and did nothing. For Schiff, and for Jews around the world, Kishinev was a horrifying symbol of the Tsar's brutal anti-Semitic policies. He saw the Russian government as a tyrannical regime that reveled in the persecution of his people, and he vowed that he would do anything in his power to see it brought to its knees. He was waiting for an opportunity, a weapon to use against the Tsar, and that weapon had just walked into London. At that dinner party, Takahashi Korekiyo, the desperate Japanese financier, was introduced to Jacob Schiff, the vengeful American banker. The meeting was a turning point in world history. As the other guests engaged in polite small talk, Schiff pulled Takahashi aside. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. He had been following the war closely, and he asked pointed, direct questions about Japan's financial situation. Takahashi, with nothing left to lose, laid his cards on the table. He explained the string of rejections, the skepticism of the international markets, and the dire state of Japan's treasury. As Schiff listened, he didn't see a risky investment. He saw an opportunity for revenge. In Japan's desperate fight for survival, Schiff saw a divine instrument to punish Tsar Nicholas II for the atrocities committed against the Jewish people. Here was a nation willing to fight and bleed to weaken the regime he despised. All they needed was money. And money was something Jacob Schiff had in abundance. His decision was immediate and absolute. He looked Takahashi in the eye and made a promise that would change the course of the war. He told him not to worry. He, Jacob Schiff, would personally see to it that Japan got the money it needed. The game had just changed. The agreement that followed was staggering. Jacob Schiff, through his network of Jewish financial institutions and his own bank, Kuhn, Loeb, and Kuh, organized a series of bond sales for Japan. The first loan alone was for $50 million, an enormous sum at the time. But it didn't stop there. Over the course of the war, Schiff would orchestrate loans totaling an almost unbelievable $200 million. To put that in perspective, this single banker raised an amount equivalent to nearly half of Japan's entire war expenditure. It was a financial masterstroke, and for Japan, it was a lifeline from heaven. The impact was immediate and dramatic. With Schiff's money flooding into the national treasury, the Japanese war machine roared back to life. The plans that had been shelved due to lack of funds were now greenlit. The 2nd, 3rd, and 4th armies, which had been waiting in Japan, could finally be transported and deployed to the mainland. This massive influx of manpower and resources allowed Japan to fully commit to its primary strategic objective, the complete encirclement and siege of the heavily fortified Russian naval base at Port Arthur. The balance of power on the battlefield shifted decisively. The money that came from a banker's quest for revenge was now being turned into artillery shells, logistics, and fresh troops on the front lines. The desperate gamble of Takahashi Korekiyo, combined with the personal vendetta of Jacob Schiff, had not only saved Japan from financial collapse but had armed it for its greatest victories yet to come. The road to the fall of Port Arthur and the climactic naval battle of Tsushima was now paved with American gold, secured by a promise made in a London drawing room. Thank you so much for watching. As 1905 dawned, the Russo-Japanese War entered its final, brutal chapter. While Japan, flush with cash from international bonds, could sustain its war effort, Russia was teetering on the brink of total collapse. Financially, the Tsarist regime was hemorrhaging money. Logistically, it was a nightmare. Their primary supply line, the Trans-Siberian Railway, was a single-track bottleneck stretching thousands of miles. It was hopelessly inadequate for supplying a massive army at the far end of the continent. Imagine trying to feed a million-man army through a single drinking straw. That was Russia's predicament. The military situation was just as dire. After a grueling and bloody siege, the fortress of Port Arthur, the prize Russia had fought so hard to keep, finally fell to the Japanese. this was a devastating blow to Russian morale and a strategic catastrophe. But the war wasn't over yet. The final, colossal land battle was about to unfold. Near the city of Mukden in Manchuria, the largest battle the world had seen up to that point took place. Nearly 750,000 men clashed in a gargantuan struggle. The Russians, despite having superior numbers, were outmaneuvered and outfought by the determined Japanese forces under Marshal Oyama Iwao. The Battle of Mukden became a decisive, albeit costly, victory for Japan. The Russian army was broken, sent into a chaotic retreat. The Tsar's commanders on the ground knew the war on land was lost. Russia's only remaining hope lay with its navy, or so they thought. In a desperate, last-ditch effort, Tsar Nicholas II had dispatched his Baltic fleet on an epic 7-month voyage around the world. Their mission? To sail from Europe all the way to the Pacific and smash the Japanese navy, relieving the pressure on his land forces. It was a monumental gamble. For 18,000 nautical miles, the aging Russian battleships steamed, a journey plagued by mishaps and international incidents. Finally, in May 1905, the exhausted Russian fleet entered the Tsushima Strait, the narrow waters separating Korea and Japan. They sailed directly into a perfectly laid trap. Admiral Togo Heihachiro and the Japanese combined fleet were waiting. What followed was not a battle, but an annihilation. The Japanese ships were faster, their sailors better trained, and their gunnery terrifyingly accurate. In less than 24 hours, the Russian Baltic fleet was utterly destroyed. Out of 38 Russian ships, 21 were sunk, 7 were captured, and only a handful managed to escape. It was one of the most decisive naval victories in history. The news of Tsushima was the final nail in Russia's coffin. With his army shattered and his navy at the bottom of the sea, Tsar Nicholas II had no choice but to sue for peace. The upstart nation of Japan had defeated the mighty Russian Empire. The world was stunned. The peace negotiations were held in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, brokered by an eager U.S. President, Theodore Roosevelt, who would later win the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts. The resulting Treaty of Portsmouth formally ended the war. Russia was forced to cede its territorial claims in Manchuria and recognize Japan's control over Korea. Japan, the small island nation, had officially arrived on the world stage as a great imperial power. And the two men who had financed this improbable victory were about to embark on the final dramatic acts of their own lives. Back in New York, Jacob Schiff was celebrated as a hero. He was a dinner guest of President Roosevelt at the White House, and in a rare honor for a foreigner, the Emperor of Japan awarded him the Order of the Sacred Treasure, and later the prestigious Order of the Rising Sun, Second Class. He had achieved his goal of humbling the anti-Semitic Tsarist regime. But for Schiff, humbling wasn't enough. He wanted it destroyed. His animosity towards the Romanov dynasty never waned. Over the next decade, as Russia stumbled from one crisis to another, Schiff watched with keen interest. A powerful and persistent belief, supported by various historical accounts and testimony, holds that Schiff's involvement didn't end in 1905. When revolution began to bubble in Russia, he saw his ultimate opportunity. It is widely alleged that in 1917, as the Bolsheviks plotted to seize power, Jacob Schiff provided significant financial backing to their cause. Figures as high as $20 million, a colossal sum at the time, are often cited. Whether this was a direct investment in Lenin's ideology or simply a final, lethal blow against the Tsar, the man who had terrorized his people, is a matter of debate. But a year later, in a dark basement in Yekaterinburg, Tsar Nicholas II, his wife, and their 5 children were executed, bringing the 300-year Romanov dynasty to a bloody and definitive end. Jacob Schiff had his ultimate revenge. Meanwhile, in Japan, Takahashi Korekiyo's star was ascending to heights he could never have imagined. His success in securing the war loans had made him a national hero. His career skyrocketed. He became the president of the Yokohama Specie Bank, then the president of the Bank of Japan itself. But he wasn't just a banker. He was a statesman. Takahashi entered politics, serving multiple terms as Japan's finance minister. He even had a brief stint as prime minister. He became one of the most influential figures in the country. His greatest challenge came in the early 1930s. As the Great Depression ravaged global economies, Japan was hit hard. As finance minister, Takahashi implemented a series of daring and unorthodox economic policies. He devalued the yen, increased government spending on public works, and cut interest rates. It was essentially the economic theory of John Maynard Keynes, but Takahashi was doing it years before. Keynes's famous theories were widely published. He was Keynes before Keynes, and it worked. While the rest of the world languished, Japan staged a remarkably swift recovery from the Great Depression, thanks in large part to Takahashi's bold vision. But this vision would put him on a collision course with the most dangerous force in Japanese society, the military. By the mid-1930s, the army had become increasingly powerful and aggressive, pushing for massive increases in military spending to fund its expansion into China. Takahashi stood firm against them. As finance minister, he controlled the nation's purse strings, and he repeatedly warned that unchecked military budgets would bankrupt the country. He cut their funding, arguing for peace and fiscal responsibility. This made him a hated figure among the young, ultra-nationalist officers who saw him as an obstacle to Japan's glorious destiny. Their resentment festered, and in the early morning hours of February 26, 1936, it exploded. A group of young army officers launched a coup d'etat in Tokyo. They targeted key government officials who they believed were corrupting the nation. One of their primary targets was the 81-year-old Takahashi Korekiyo. The assassins burst into his home and found the elderly statesman in his bedroom. They shot him multiple times, ending the life of the man who had saved Japan from financial ruin twice. Takahashi's assassination was a turning point. It marked the effective end of civilian-led democratic government in pre-war Japan. The military had silenced its most powerful critic, and the path to a wider, more catastrophic war was now clear. It's a tragic, violent end for one of the key architects of Japan's modern rise. Two men, a Jewish-American banker and a Japanese samurai's son, joined by a common cause, achieved an impossible victory. One lived to see his enemy utterly destroyed, his revenge complete. The other rose to the pinnacle of power, saved his nation's economy, and was ultimately killed by the very forces of militarism he had helped to unleash. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this story as fascinating as I did, please hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the dramatic chapters of history. See you in the next one.